Hello again, and welcome everyone to this webinar hosted by Trase. I am the communications lead for Trase. My name is Jolene Tan. Today's webinar will be introducing how the finance sector is exposed to deforestation-related risks and how due diligence process can be used to manage these risks. So before I move to introduce the speakers, I'm just going to cover a couple of housekeeping points before we start. So there will be the chance to have a Q&A session after the presentations. Please post questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. Questions will be answered mostly in the second half of the webinar, but we may also answer some of the questions via chat or by typing in the Q&A box. This webinar is 45 minutes long. We're going to share the recording after the event with registrants, and it will also be uploaded to the Trase YouTube. So if anybody you know would be interested in watching, please feel free to share that with them. If there are any media present, please feel free to contact us separately about any media queries on the subject of this webinar. The email address is media@trase.earth. So just to introduce our speakers today, first of all, we have the Sustainable Finance Associate at Trase, Josh Brewer. We also have had with us today, we intended to have Elizabeth Ipo, who is Biodiversity and Natural Capital Manager at BNP Paribas. She hasn't joined yet, so we're hoping that she will join us a little later in the event, but we're expecting her to present as well. And not presenting, but present is also Helen Belfield, who is the Trase Deputy Director, and she will be answering questions in the chat and also via the Q&A box. So especially any questions about Trase data and the scope of our data offerings, Helen will be very well placed to take. So that's the introduction for now. So I'm now going to hand the baton over to Josh, who is going to explain what is at stake here? Why would it be beneficial for banks and investors to carry out due diligence for deforestation-related risks, and how can this be done? Josh, take it away.
Thanks, Jolene. Thanks for the introduction. And thank you to everyone as well for joining today. It's great to have such a large number of people join the webinar. Yes, I will just share my screen. And so what I'll be talking about today is kind of giving an introduction to due diligence and deforestation, and how those two can kind of interact when thinking about a financial institution audience. So I'm going to start off doing a little bit of introduction to Trase supply chains and Trase finance, and then go on to talk more detail about deforestation due diligence. So what are the key drivers? Where should financial institutions look to use deforestation due diligence within their financing activity? How data can be used to drive more informed decision making when it comes to due diligence. So first off, introduction to Trase. So what is Trase? So Trase is basically a supply chain, soft commodity supply chain mapping approach, which focuses on tropical deforestation. It's a data-driven transparency initiative. So the founding partners are Stockholm Environmental Institute and Global Canopy, but we have a number of other partners that we work with as well. Origa, UC Leuven, EFI, Imaflora, Neural Alpha, more on them later, and University of California, Santa Barbara. And we have many other research partners as well. But the fundamental idea behind Trase is that it enables stakeholders like companies, like financial institutions, governments, civil society, to take practical steps to address deforestation. And I think that there's this real emphasis on practicality, you know, how to enable real genuine change to take place and to provide tools and data needed to make those changes. So what Trase does is it maps the center part of the supply chain. If you think of a supply chain you have the farmers for soft commodities on the left-hand side, farmers and producers, and then you get to the point of export, and it's that piece in between. So it's the slaughterhouses, it's the processing sheds, it's the crushers, it's those assets, it's the location of those assets, and then it's the movement of those assets along the supply chain till it gets to the point of export. And it's looking at key soft commodity supply chains around soy, beef, palm oil, cocoa. These are the main drivers of tropical deforestation. It uses publicly available information, such as tax information, to create that link from point of export back to the municipality. And I think if we think about it in terms of the shape of it, it's really, the supply chain is an hourglass shape. On the left-hand side, you have the farmers. On the right-hand side, you might have retailers, manufacturers. But in the middle, it sort of narrows, so you get an hourglass shape. And this is where you get a real concentration amongst traders and producers who dominate that part of the supply chain. But this is where the risk becomes highly concentrated too. So what's Trase Finance? So this is a partnership with sustainable fintech consultancy Neural Alpha. It basically builds on the supply chain data that comes from Trase Earth, but adds in additional information which is really essential for understanding the financial audience. So it adds in finance flows to traders and producers, debt and equity, and also additional data such as unique identifiers, company legal hierarchies, ultimate global parent. And it can lay in additional data sets like asset information, for example. And for this reason, it's really useful data for a finance audience. It's been treated so that it's in a highly usable form for that audience. And here we're talking about asset owners, asset managers, banks, financial service providers. And so it's in a form that is easily transferable across the due diligence processes. So why deforestation due diligence? What are the key drivers for pushing towards more deforestation due diligence? So if we just go back, take a step back and look at the big picture. In the last 30 years, we've lost a staggering 420 million hectares of tropical forest. Now that process has slowed. In the last 5 years, that's slowed to about 10 million hectares a year, but that's still an area the size of Iceland or South Korea. If deforestation was a country, it would be the world's third biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions at 11%. But it's not just about greenhouse gas emissions. Tropical deforestation leads to a very significant negative impact on biodiversity. We see huge biodiversity loss as a result of it. And there's also a very strong association with human rights abuses and to deforestation as well. So as such, what we're talking about here is a systemic risk. It's to both the economy, but it's to our wider well-being as a species. So how are finance institutions exposed? So they're exposed through their investments, their services, their loans to companies that produce or use agricultural commodities in particular contexts. So if you think about beef and soy from Brazil or palm oil from Indonesia, and that's both upstream and downstream in terms of thinking about the supply chain. So a piece of research from Global Witness in 2021 identified that banks and investors with inadequate policies on deforestation provided nearly $3 trillion to companies with the highest exposure to deforestation risk. So there is a huge, partially or totally unmitigated risk out there in relation to deforestation. Now, I think it's fair to say that has been increased focus on nature, biodiversity and deforestation, which is actually driving, an increased movement towards implementing due diligence policies. I think there are probably three key main drivers here. So one, it's fair to say that the finance sector or certain actors within the finance sector have picked this up as a significant risk. We're seeing some great initiatives like Finance Sector Deforestation Action. So we've got 35 financial institutions with assets under management of $9 trillion, and they've committed to deforestation-free portfolios by 2025. We also have the development of a risk management and disclosure framework for companies and financial institutions in the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure. This follows on from the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. It's very likely that this is going to be an increasingly important framework. It's in the pilot stage at the moment, and it's going to go live at the end of the year. And this is going to provide a sort of, disclosure and set of data which will provide impetus for financial institutions to develop due diligence processes to manage their exposure to deforestation. And then finally, the regulatory landscape is changing, and I think this is probably one of the most important aspects. So we now have an EU law that's going to require companies to conduct due diligence on commodity imports to ensure that there's no embedded deforestation within those imports. We're seeing similar regulations in development in both the UK and the US. I think particularly importantly for that EU regulation, it's going to be reviewed in 2 years' time to see if the finance sector needs to be added to the list of companies carrying out that due diligence. So this is becoming a compliance issue. So as such, it sits very squarely within due diligence processes. So where should FIs use deforestation due diligence? So we think a little bit about the wider context. So we have money laundering, financing for terrorism, bribery and corruption, mandatory due diligence processes in place already across the finance sector, very familiar with those sorts of processes. We're getting voluntary due diligence processes relating to ESG factors. I think fossil fuel financing is a good example. Quite a few companies now have policies on tar sands or on new coal production, where there is a due diligence process that now needs to be carried out to enforce those policies. And so this fits very well with implementing deforestation due diligence. And I think in terms of relevance, we can talk about equity investments, we can talk about bond issues, corporate lending, corporate finance services. I think one area that's probably been maybe ignored to an extent is around know your customer checks on bank lending and kind of sell-side investment banking services. Thinking here about things like book running or underwriting. These are really important in the soft commodity sectors. They represent significant financial flows into these markets. Lots of the companies, lots of those traders and producers who are in the middle of that supply chain tend to be private companies. So they're not going out they're not issuing equities, but they certainly need to fund commercial activities through debt. And so that's where there becomes that interaction and due diligence processes come into place. That's not to say that equity isn't also, relevant for this. If we could have asset managers screening of listed equities ahead of inclusion in a portfolio, as well as post-investment monitoring and engagement activities. So how can we move to data-driven decision-making? How can trace data be used to inform those due diligence processes? So I think good quality data is absolutely fundamental to identifying and quantifying financial institution exposure to risk. Trace data is granular enough that it can enable an actor to focus on the highest risk companies and the assets and localities. If you just think about that process, this trace process, so what does it do? It maps the location of assets, such as a slaughterhouse or processing shed. It then examines the supply chain to the point of export and connects those assets to the supply chain. We're using publicly available information like tax records here. And then there's a move back to that location. And so then we can use other data sets to understand the location-specific deforestation impacts, so land conversion, where deforestation is taking place. And then by having that picture, we can assess the deforestation exposure of a trader's supply chain. So it's important to say we can't go right down to the causal point. We can't say this piece of beef here caused this piece of deforestation, but what we can say is that this piece of beef was sourced from this area where this company has this level of deforestation risk. So in thinking about due diligence processes, we often see kind of decision tree processes where there are risk flags which could come up at each stage. So this could come at a variety of stages. So you could be looking at the company information, like is there an opaque company structure? That's a flag. Thinking about company activity. So does it source from a particular, a deforestation frontier area? So that's another flag. Let's look at the company policy. Let's identify other areas of weaknesses. Does it have a lack of zero deforestation commitments applied to its activities? And where these flags are triggered, then that indicates a point where a financial institution might need to conduct further investigation to understand more about the level of that risk and the size of that risk and what needs to be done in order to manage and mitigate that risk. So just move on to the last slide here. So as part of our broader work that we do on producing deforestation guidance for financial institutions, we're developing a set of due diligence guidance. And building out of that piece of work here, we've got a sample process diagram. And what this process diagram is, it shows 4 different stages around profiling, screening, then you can dive more into location-specific analysis before finally arriving at that decision. Is that a yes? Is it a no? Is it yes, go ahead, but there need to be specific engagement plans in place, for example? But each one of these stages has distinct data requirements in order to be completed, and Trase can provide for all of those data requirements. So, I think it's fair to say financial institutions have an enormous amount of leverage. They're not the direct decision makers, but because through the provision of finance, they're in a really strong position to redirect finance away from activities driving deforestation, and therefore to drive company activity away from driving deforestation. So this can be thought of in some ways as enlightened self-interest. You can help tackle biodiversity emergency and at the same time also reduce your own exposure to deforestation risk as a financial institution. So in order to do that, you need data and tools, and that does exist. Trase is available that can enable due diligence for deforestation by financial institutions. So just like to finish up there, say thank you for listening. If you are interested in follow-up about finding more about the data and how Trase can help, please do get in touch. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that presentation, Josh. And just to let everybody know, yesterday we also published on the Trase website an article which summarizes a lot of what Josh has presented today as well. So my colleague Athena, I think, has put the link to that article in the chat. So if you're interested in reading that, sharing that, discussing it further, please do take a look. Unfortunately, Elizabeth is not yet with us, so I think maybe what we can do is begin with some of the questions that we've been asked, and hopefully she will join shortly. So one question, first question for you, Josh, from David Hecht in the Q&A box. David asks, besides banks and investors exposure, what about exposure for insurers that companies have policies with? Is this something that you can comment on?
Yes, I think insurers are, it's very much relevant for insurers. I think of any of the finance actors, they're probably most cognizant of systemic risk. Particularly if you think about climate change, it becomes increasingly difficult to insure companies as temperatures rise and we get more disruption to weather patterns, for example. And deforestation and biodiversity represent similar types of risks where we might see collapse of supply chains, for example. So I'd say very much relevant for the insurance sector.
Great, thanks, Josh. We've had another question in chat from Yuan Salazar asking about Forest IQ. And Yuan wants to know how the upcoming solution Forest IQ is similar to or different from Trase Finance.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Juan. So Forest IQ is a data product that's being developed, which gives a broader coverage. So Trase Finance enables a real kind of deep dive focus into the traders and producers and the finance flows into that part of the supply chain. Whereas the concept behind Forest IQ is it provides a broader analysis of the supply chain, both upstream and downstream. So obviously it looks at the traders and producers, but it also goes to look down at retailers and manufacturers. But I think what it does is it's providing that broader view, but it's not as deep as you get within Trase Finance. So Trase and Trase Finance provides that real information on geospatial location of risk and risk exposure, whereas at the moment, and how Forest IQ is currently envisaged, it's going to identify where risk exposure takes place, but it's not going to be able to go down to that granular level that Trase enables. So I'd say they're different and complementary. I would say the starting point is probably going to be Forest IQ, and then where you've identified that exposure and that risk, the next phase is to then move into Trase Finance and to really understand more about that risk by doing that.
Great, thanks, Josh. I just want to acknowledge that we have a few questions in the Q&A box which have to do with the nature of the data. And just to say that Helen Belfield is answering some of those in text form, so we're not ignoring your questions. We're getting around to them, but I'm just prioritizing for Josh the questions that are about other aspects. So we had another question, this one anonymous, regarding the TNFD. I'm not entirely sure I understand all of the question. It says the TNFD proposes soft reporting metrics, while Trase enables, and tools like Trase enable transparency in global supply chains. And this questioner thinks that Trase data and disclosure on suppliers and grievances may be more important than TNFD disclosure recommendations. But then the question is, how could TNFD reporting help platforms such as Trase? And maybe we can answer both ways around as well. Maybe there's ways in which I think Trase data could also help people with TNFD obligations. But Josh, maybe you can comment on the relationship between the two.
Yes, I mean, I'm just going to caveat that by saying that I'm not as close to the TNFD as some of my colleagues are. But I think the key thing about the TNFD is it's a framework for both identifying risk, but a disclosure framework as well. And as such, it's going to, because if you compare that with Trase is not so much a disclosure framework. Trase actually, builds a picture of a supply chain from third-party data sources such as tax information, which is not coming directly from the company. Whereas what TNFD will do will encourage that greater disclosure at company level, which I think will then integrate with Trase to be able to enable greater transparency on the supply chains. And I think that's probably the great advantage. I think my hope is that what TNFD will enable is greater transparency further downstream on supply chains, as we get greater disclosure from companies on who their suppliers are, what the specifics are of their supply chains, and then we can connect that into something like Trase and look further upstream to identify, to really quantify that risk. So I think there's a point at the moment where when you get to the point of export, that it becomes much more difficult in terms of Trase to be able to understand what's happening in that supply chain. Now, hopefully TNFD will fill some of those pieces of the puzzle so that we can build that clearer picture, end to end of that supply chain.
Thanks, Josh. We're still waiting for Elizabeth, so I'm afraid I'm just going to keep those questions coming at you. Another question by Christiana Siligiani. I hope I've got your name right. She says, hi, Josh, could you discuss your reaction or feedback on the EU regulation? How much will this impact companies, especially since it doesn't fully cover the Cerrado?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Again, I might defer. I don't know if Helen might have some view on this as well. She's been very much closer to those negotiations. I mean, I think the key thing with the regulation is it just sets the standard. It for companies that they are going to have to disclose this information, they are going to have to start carrying out this due diligence. My understanding of the regulation is that as we move forward through time, that there's going to be expansion of the biomes that are covered under the regulation. And so although the Cerrado is not in the initial set of biomes, that over time it will become part of the deforestation policy from the EU. Helen, if that's not exactly correct, please come in and correct me, but that is my understanding.
Yes, so just to add there, at the moment, so the regulation defines forests and therefore deforestation using the FAO definition of forests. Trase has done some analysis, which I think we can share in the chat, which shows that this has limited coverage in the Cerrado, which is where a lot of the EU exposure is, but that extending that definition to cover other wooded lands, which will be reviewed in a year's time from when it comes into force. So we're expecting it to come into force from April to June this year. There'll be a review June 2024 in that case to see whether we extend it to other wooded lands. And most of the due diligence requirements come into play anyway at the end of 2024. So hopefully that will be covered, and that's certainly what we'll be advocating for through our data. And as Josh said, the big change is it's setting new norms on traceability requirements. So companies will have to be able to provide the polygons, so the georeference location of where all of these products have come from, and then to be able to demonstrate that they are deforestation free and produce legally in compliance with producer country law. So it really is a massive shift in norms and expectations in this space.
Thanks, Helen. All right, we still don't have Elizabeth yet, so I'm afraid you're still in the hot seat, Josh. So there's another question we've had from Anderson Lee saying that several financial institutions have been making commitments to stop deforestation. Are they all credible? But what would make a deforestation commitment credible and ambitious?
So we've done a lot of work on this in terms of we've developed a set of guidance for financial institutions on how they can actually move towards deforestation-free portfolios. So my advice would be, is to measure those commitments against how well they're adopting the guidance that we've laid out for financial institutions. So I think fundamental to that is, it's various stages. It's about risk assessment, it's about companies understanding what their current exposure is, and then it's about developing policies that address deforestation and then implementing those policies. So I think fundamental to this is this development of policies, and I'm certainly aware of quite a few financial institutions that are in the process of developing those policies. We do track this each year. We do a sort of benchmarking process on deforestation, something called the Deforestation Action Tracker, which looks at financial institutions that are in GFANZ and assesses their current commitments and policies around deforestation. So I think it's to see, over time, do we see changes in the scores of those companies on how well they perform? It's probably the key tracking that we can do. But I think, having publicly available policies that are in place and then a plan for implementing those is a great place to start.
Thanks, Josh. Maybe you can comment. I wonder whether this would be a good place to answer another question by Veronica Robledo, who asks, does this work presented today link directly with Global Canopy's deforestation-free finance sector roadmap? So maybe you can talk a bit about how these join up.
Yes, so deforestation-free guidance is quite a broad set of guidance. Just speaking about it then on how financial institutions can move towards having deforestation-free portfolios. Now, as I mentioned earlier, as part of this suite of guidance that we're developing, so we've already developed some for asset owners. We are now developing a set of guidance on due diligence, which is very much about identifying the various steps of a due diligence process, providing those frameworks, and then identifying the data that can feed into the various steps of those frameworks. So the current plan is to actually be able to make that publicly available in around April this year. So at that point in time, we will have a publicly available set of due diligence guidance for financial institutions, which will very much link into what we've been talking about today in terms of identifying where you can make data, part of that due diligence process.
Thanks, Josh. So I'm just trying to look for those questions that I think Helen probably won't be answering. We had another anonymous question in the Q&A box asking about whether financial institutions have confidence in our data, and observing that many FIs need convincing that, even though data isn't perfect, there's still enough of it to go ahead and make an assessment. So maybe you can tell us more about how to bridge that gap.
Yeah, I think this is the key thing. I mean, I think there is data available. I think Trase does provide data that can be used, which is high quality data on trader and producer exposure to deforestation risk. There are some data gaps. I've just mentioned some of those previously when talking about maybe as you move more downstream, sort of post-export. But I think, the key thing is here, let's not make perfection be the enemy of the good. There is large amounts of data out there. There is going to be continuing to be more and more data becoming available. TNFD is going to drive that. What we're doing with Forest IQ at the moment is to try and bring together some of these more sort of disparate data sources and to try and bring them all into one place as well. So there's consolidation of data taking place as well. So I don't really feel like, there's not really an excuse to be starting these processes now and to use the available data, because there is good data there, and that data is only going to get better and deeper and more granular.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I've also just put into the chat a link to some work that Trase did with the French Ministry for Ecological Transition in providing data on sort of exposure to deforestation for soy exports, soy imports into France. And just wanted to highlight also that the data that a platform like Trase provides can also be the beginning to ask questions in order to inspire further disclosure. And that's what we found with this French dashboard as well, that French soy importers would then disclose more in response. So, data can beget more data, I guess. So to go on to our next question, we've got about 10 minutes left. I'm really hoping that Elizabeth will make it. I see from a comment from her colleague Marguerite that she has got tied up in a call. So we're just waiting for her. In the meantime, I just want to see whether maybe we have time for another one of the questions that attendees have asked. Elizabeth cannot get access. Okay, my colleague Athena is going to communicate with her about that. In the meantime, maybe we can take one more question. Let me see. Sajeev Mohan Kumar in the questions asks how Trase methodology aligns with other standards like SBTI flag, GHG land sector and removal guidance, and the accountability framework initiative. I mean, this is like 3 questions in one, so I don't know if you want to just start on one first, maybe Josh, and we'll see how far we can get. And hopefully Elizabeth will join us.
Yeah, so just on the accountability framework initiative. So it's interesting, actually, what we've developed with Forest IQ is an attempt to bring together quite a few disparate data sources. And this includes information from Trase, as well as information from some of Global Canopy's other data sort of tracking projects like Forest 500. It also brings in Zoological Society of London data, ROSPA data, FAO data, and it uses the accountability framework as the framework to try and make these data sets comparable and knit together so that a user is able to use those different data sets in a way that enables comparability across a portfolio, for example. So that's an example there with the Accountability Framework Initiative. I have to be clear on so SBTI, for example, I'm not so clear on that. That might be a question for Helen to answer. I know that certainly TNFD is looking to align into is one of those, is in process and is looking to align with SBTI, and that also what we'll be doing in Trase will look to align with TNFD.
Great, thank you, Josh. So there's a little bit of back and forth in the sort of panelist chat about Elizabeth, who I think is having some connection difficulties, and we're still hoping that she can join us. We only have a few minutes left. So maybe in order to maximize the time for her presentation, when she does join us, I'm just going to run through a few things now for everybody. So just to let everybody know that if you want to know more and have more detailed questions about Trase methodology, then you might want to look out for our regular introduction to Trase webinars, which we're holding on a regular basis. They kind of rotate in timing throughout the day because we want to cover all the time zones. So the next one is in an Asian-friendly time zone. I've just put the link in the chat. So if you have further questions that want to delve deeper into the methodology, please do join one of these webinars. We're holding them every 2 months at the moment. And if you want to stay up to date with what we're doing at Trase and get notification of more of our events, please also sign up for our mailing list. I have put the link to that in the chat as well. And just one more time for completeness, even though I think we've shared it previously, I'm just going to add the link to Josh's article, which covers a lot of the ground that was discussed today as well. So please do check these out. I am not sure whether we are able to get any more updates on Elizabeth. So maybe I'll just, are you up for another question, Josh? Okay, cool. So Mel Lagadek in the chat says, it seems that the data we use can be used for investor engagement and voting decisions and banks' advisory activities with their corporate clients. Do we support such use cases?
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the real advantages of the data set that it provides very clear picture about performance of a company, and so as such, it's a great engagement tool. I think particularly when thinking about an investee company, for example, so you can identify the risk of exposure using Trase Finance, and then you can look at, for example, Forest 500 information to see how well that company is managing that risks through its policies and systems and reporting, and in that way you can, it's a very powerful engagement and voting tool. There's a good case study of this actually that we have on the website. Storebrand has used the data in an engagement with Bunge. Really worth taking a look at that to see, how a financial institution might approach that engagement process. And Jolene is right on it and has put that in the chat straight away. Brilliant.
Yeah, great. So I don't know whether we are going to be able to get Elizabeth in, because I think even if she joins now, where it will really be the kind of very whirlwind tour of BNP Paribas experience, which is unfortunate because we'd really hoped to be able to discuss that today as well. Yeah, we can, there aren't really that many questions left. There's a handful if you want to go on, Josh. maybe just one very quick one. Will Forest IQ be a paid for service or free for use?
Right, so it will be both. So it's the model is a freemium. Well, what we're working on is what we call a freemium model. So what we're about, what Global Canopy is about, is transparency, and so there will be part of that data set which will be freely available, but there will be another part of the data set which probably contains things which are useful for a financial audience, such as ISIN code indicators, maybe revenue data, that kind of information, which will have a paid for element to it. And I think it's important for us as an organization that we're able to, enable to sustainably keep being able to deliver the data products that we do need to bring in revenue in order to support that.
So yes, thank you very much, everyone. Thanks to Josh for your presentation.
Thank you, Jolene, and thanks everyone for joining us. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, we'll be in touch, and we'll send everybody the recording of the session as well.
Yeah, and just as I mentioned, if anybody does want to have a follow-up, find out more about trace data and how that can be used for due diligence processes, but other financial institution use cases as well, please do get in touch.